Telepathic Visit. It is also narrated that near Maulana's seminary lived a young merchant who was attracted by the teachings. This youth, however, was very anxious to travel to Egypt, although his friends advised against it. When Maulana heard of the plan, he too pronounced against the journey. The merchant, however, was determined to travel. One fine night he started towards Syria. Reaching Antakya, he boarded a ship bound for Egypt. As ill luck would have it, the ship was captured by the Franks, and with it the young merchant, who was flung into a dungeon. He was very poorly fed. For fully 40 days he remained in that dark cell, and constantly wailed that this imprisonment was due to his disobeying his spiritual master, Maulana. On the 40th night, however, he saw Maulana in a dream, who said that the next morning, when he, the merchant, was to be interrogated by his Frank captors, to every question put to him he was to reply in the affirmative. He woke with a start, and sure enough, when the Franks came to question him with a translator, asking whether he knew anything about medicine, he, as instructed in his dream the previous night, said that he was an expert medical man. The Franks were very pleased to hear that, and asked him to come immediately to see their king, who was ill and needed urgent medical attention. The prisoner was given suitable clothes, and taken to the palace at once, as a distinguished physician. On the way, an inspiration came to him, and after seeing the patient, he prescribed that 7 kinds of fruits were to be brought and their juice extracted and given to the patient. By the grace of God, the king's ailment took an immediate turn for the better. The king was greatly pleased, and the young merchant thenceforward became an honoured guest. Even although that young man was completely illiterate, yet help came to him. Sublime hearts come to aid when the cry of the oppressed reaches them for help. When the king regained his normal health, he asked the merchant in what way he could reward him. The young merchant asked merely to be released and sent home in order to bend his knee before his spiritual master. He was released and gifts were given to him, and he now related his story to the Franks, who were considerably impressed by Maulana's help and spiritual powers. When the merchant reached Konya, he went straight to Maulana's house. Kissing his feet, he touched them in thanksgiving and reverence. Maulana expressed his pleasure at seeing the young merchant and kissed his disciple's face affectionately, remarking, "After this experience of pleasing the Franks and securing your release, now endeavour even more than before to earn a living in contentment and in righteousness. For contentment is a mercy of God, and greed leads to the darkness of dungeons." Rich and Poor. It is likewise narrated that one day some zealous disciples of Maulana expressed regret that the more important people of the town did not visit Maulana, but often went to much lesser men of learning and piety. They considered that those citizens did not fully appreciate the greatness of Maulana. To all this, Maulana replied that if he received the wealthy and important men of the town, then the poorer would be deprived of his company. It was as if the complaint of the disciples of Maulana travelled to the ears of the richer community of Konya. The very next morning, a large number of those endowed with worldly substance in the city arrived to be blessed by Maulana. Amongst them were such men of standing as Fakhruddin, Moinuddin, Jalaluddin Mustafa, and Aminuddin Mayakayal. The terrace of Maulana's house was filled to overflowing with the celebrities of the city, and there was no room left in the seminary for the poorer disciples to listen to the discourse of their master. In consequence, such people had to stand outside the house, receiving little or no attention from Maulana, a matter of great unhappiness to those less fortunate in worldly goods. As soon, however, as the rich gentry left the terrace, the poor disciples came in and complained respectfully to Maulana at having been left out. The master pacified them by saying that his real friends were the poor, and that his preaching and discourses were always dedicated to the humbler and less rich, and that the rich, in effect, received the instructions as a residue of those of the poor. As, for instance, people drink the milk of goats after their young have been supplied with milk by their mothers. The residue is for the wealthier, and the fuller virtue was fed to the poorer disciples. Maulana further added that the influx occurred because the poorer disciples themselves had complained in the first place about the non-attendance of the gentry. Maulana had not invited them himself. The disciples therefore should not take it ill, and should pray that the richer class might always tread the right path of virtue, and not trouble the dervishes, but continue to earn their livelihood in peace and contentment. The name of a city. It is also narrated that one day, Maulana had been attending a meeting at a house where Sheikh Ziauddin was reciting the Quranic text in which the following verse occurred. Consider the early hours of the dawn, and the night when it covers with darkness. Your Lord has not forsaken you, nor has he become displeased with you. This verse affected Maulana greatly, but Hisamuddin apologized that the reciter did not recite the Quran in simple tones, but rather with an affectation. Maulana observed that this reminded him of an incident when a grammarian, who was on a journey, asked a simple seeker whether that was the town which he had been seeking. The grammarian's highfalutin pronunciation did not quite conform to the simple usage of the locality, and therefore the unassuming seeker simply replied that he had never heard the name of such a city. This meant, of course, that although the text of the Quran was the same as that which Maulana knew, yet by the affectation of the reciter it lacked the simplicity of the spirit. The grammarian in the story insisted that the proper pronunciation was just what he was using, and the seeker replied that that might well be the case, but the citizens of that city spoke the name in a certain way, and so the grammarian must mean another city. The ladder and the rope. It is also narrated that once Maulana was giving a discourse on the higher aspects of spiritual philosophy. He included in his narration a story that a dervish was passing a dry well, in which a grammarian had fallen by accident on a dark night, and the unfortunate man cried out for help. The dervish called out to other men to fetch a rope and a ladder to rescue the man in the well. But the grammarian shouted up to the dervish that according to proper usage, he ought to employ the word ladder first, and the word rope afterwards. Thereupon the dervish replied, "Remain where you are, till I learn proper diction." Maulana deduced the lesson from this story that those who are constantly engaged in hair-splitting and do not try to reveal the inner meanings of things are like the man in the well. They remain in the difficulties of their self-assumed scholarship, nor do they seek a master who might lead them to the worthwhile spiritual destination. It is likewise narrated that the saintly Salahuddin had a disciple who was very much attached to Maulana and was in the business of buying and selling. This merchant was for long nursing the thought of visiting Istanbul. When he had made all the arrangements, he came to say goodbye to Maulana and to seek his blessing and grace. The monk and the miracle. Maulana said to the merchant that when he was in Istanbul he should visit a Christian monk who had renounced the world and lived in the neighborhood, and should convey to him Maulana's greetings and salutations. Upon arriving in the city of the Turks, The very first thing that the merchant did was to visit the Frankish monk, whom he found in profound contemplation, with a halo of righteousness around him. With much respect, the merchant conveyed the greetings of Maulana to the monk, and the monk rose with respect to receive those expressions of friendship. Then the monk bent his knees in prayer. The merchant could not help glancing around the cloister. To his bewilderment, he saw Maulana sitting in a corner, also in deep contemplation. Maulana wore the same clothes, the same turban, and had the same expression on his face as he had seen when he had bade him goodbye at Konya. The merchant was so shocked by this manifestation that he became unconscious. When he recovered, the monk pacified him. He said if he, the merchant, could become aware of the mysteries of the free, he would become higher in spiritual level. The monk gave him a letter to those responsible to afford all facilities to the merchant in his travels and work. The merchant brought that letter to the king at Istanbul, who gave him a royal welcome and fulfilled all his requirements. After that he went back to the monk to take leave of that man of piety, and the monk, like Maulana, commissioned the merchant to carry his greetings to Maulana, and to say that Maulana might graciously not forget to send his blessings to the monk. When, however, the merchant returned to his home in Konya, he related the incidents of his journey to the Sheikh Salahuddin, who observed that whatever saintly persons say is ever correct, but advised the merchant not to recite the facts of this mystical happening to those who did not belong to the esoteric fold. Thereupon he took the merchant to Maulana, to whom he conveyed the salutations of the Christian monk in Istanbul. Maulana said to the merchant, "Look, and you will see wonder." What did the merchant then behold to his utter wonderment, but that the monk sat in the corner of Maulana's room in deep contemplation, and wore the same garments as the merchant had seen him wear in Istanbul. The merchant tore his clothes in the ecstasy of the whole scene, for the thing had passed all human comprehension. Maulana took the merchant aside and said, "After what you have seen hidden mysteries, and you are now our confidant. Do not reveal these facts to the unworthy, those of little knowledge of mystic lore." And then Maulana recited a couplet. "The one who may not reveal the secret of the Sultan, nor cast sugar before the ants, he alone can receive the secrets, otherwise it is like throwing jewels before the cows." The merchant was greatly moved, gave all his fortune to the poor, and renouncing worldly affairs became a devoted disciple of the Master. It is also narrated that one day Maulana was going towards the town from his mosque when he saw a bearded monk, and asked him whether his white beard was older than his age. To this the monk replied that he had grown his beard since he was 20 years of age. "Then you are older than your beard," observed Maulana. He continued, "It is a great pity that that which is younger than you has become white with virtue and holiness, and you remain the same in the dark alleys of life, and you continue in the path which your beard has not taken." The monk at once saw the point, broke his rosary, and joining the faith, became one of the great disciples of Maulana. In like manner, once they saw a group of those with black robes, and the disciples pitied them for having strayed from the true path, and as people who had no real thought of spiritual life and mystic feeling. The disciples reflected that if the sun of guidance could shine upon the blackness of those berobed persons, even quite by accident, they could have their path enlightened. As soon as these men came within sight of Maulana, the sun shone upon them, and they immediately came to the path trod by Maulana, and ultimately became devoted disciples. It is said that God conceals darkness in whiteness, and produces whiteness from darkness." Hearing this wise saying, the disciples bent their heads further in acceptance of the truths uttered by Maulana. Perfecting the inner being. It is likewise narrated that once Maulana Ikhtiaruddin Faqih, the famous doctor of law, was late in returning from the Friday prayer to the house of Maulana, despite the fact that Maulana had asked for his presence several times. Upon his return, Maulana asked him the cause of his delay. The doctor replied that he was detained because a preacher from Khojand was delivering a sermon, during which it was difficult for him to leave the congregation. Maulana asked what the text upon which the preacher's discourse was based, and he was informed that the mullah of Khojand spoke on the point of the good fortune that he and his audience enjoyed in being what they were, and exhorted upon his hearers to give thanks to God that he and they were not born outside the fold of the faith. Maulana said with a smile, "The poor mullah has exalted himself over the prophets and saints in saying that, and feeling that they were the only exalted ones. Such men do not perceive their inward self, meaning that these people were great sinners and had little insight into their mystical being, and they looked only upon the outer self of the human being, neglecting the mystery of mystic meaning. And these people do not realize the excellence of those who had perfected their inner being with mystic light." And then Maulana recited a poem. "There are those whose wings beat around the throne of Allah, and the angels and saintly men are those who love the Lord." Stone into ruby. It is also narrated that the great litterateur Hisamul Milla Wadin Amasi, who in addition to his other qualities was also one of the major disciples, related that one Badruddin Tabrizi, who was skilled in mathematics, astronomy, chemistry, and history, had related amongst the friends that he was one of those who had taken part with Maulana at a mystical music meeting until dawn one night in the garden of Chalabi Hisamuddin, and at dawn Maulana allowed the disciples to close their eyes in sleep for a short while, whilst he himself plunged himself into deep contemplation. And Badruddin said, "I, too, reclined to rest, but my mind was at work. For I was thinking that great persons like Seth and Jesus and Idris and Solomon and Luqman and Khizr, all of great mystical attainments, had manifested miracles, and these men of high qualities had extraordinary mastery and dexterity, for instance in curing skins, high crafts of transmuting baser metals into gold and the like, which were beyond all human capabilities. And I wondered as to whether Maulana was blessed with any of such qualities. I was in such thoughts when suddenly, as if a tiger had jumped at me, Maulana called hoarsely my name and placed a piece of stone in my left hand and said, 'Go and give thanks to God.' And when I looked closely at the stone, it had turned into a giant ruby of such quality that I had not seen in the treasury of any king. This incident so affected me that I cried out, and those of my compatriots who were sleeping woke up and asked me why I shouted and at such an hour, yelling like the voices of 10 persons. Badruddin added that he wept a long time, seeking the forgiveness of Maulana, for thinking thus wise about what supernatural phenomena he could perform. Maulana forgave him, and then he took the converted stone ruby to Maulana's daughter and gave it to her as a gift. She at once converted the ruby into money, 108,000 dirhams, and spent the sum upon the various necessities of the disciples and needy men and women. Maulana, commenting upon the incident later, inquired whether we had not heard the story of a dervish who had changed the dry branch of a tree into a bow of solid gold, and that type of people were his friends, and further added that although it was a matter of great wonderment to convert lifeless objects, stones and vegetables, into precious metals, yet it was a greater quality to convert the soul and mind of the living into mystical gold. And he recited, "Of a truth wonderful it is to transmute copper into gold by the philosopher's stone. But note the wonder still that a copper converts minute after minute the philosopher's stone." Shoes of iron. It is also narrated that Maulana Shamsuddin Malti, may Allah bless his soul, related that when Sheikh Masaruddin, son of Sheikh Saifuddin Bakhazi, Allah bless his soul, reached Konya, a large number of the learned people and others of status came to meet him, and gave him much respect and attention due to his sanctity and piety. Quite by accident, it so happened that on that day Maulana was passing the Sheikh's rest house with his disciples, and Sheikh Masaruddin perhaps might have said that the news of the arrival of the great sage had not reached the ears of Maulana, indirectly suggesting that Maulana was expected to come and see the visitor. One of the disciples, hearing the suggestion, mentioned the matter to Maulana, who observed that the man who was the real visitor was he, and not the man who had come to Konya, and thus it was more true that the sheikh should have come first to see him, and not he to go to the sheikh. The disciples were, however, unable to follow the comment and sought an explanation, and were told in the following terms: "We have arrived here from the city of Baghdad, of that who is all in all, which pervades all that is. And that brother of ours had only come from a street of the mere Baghdad of stone and clay. Thus we are the real visitors, and not he." The allusion here is a mystical one, meaning that men soaked in the mystery of mysticism see God in everything, every stone and leaf, and appreciate the oneness of God in the oneness of all that exists. When the report reached the visiting sheikh, he too, being a man of virtue and inward appreciation, acknowledged the true meaning, and came to pay his respects to Maulana, and became one of his great devotees. And the visiting sage further added that whatever his father had said was true, that one ought to wear shoes of iron that do not get broken by long walks, and to have a staff of iron for rest, and to go in search of a master like the Maulana for spiritual uplift.